There are nights that feel staged, like someone else wrote them and forgot to warn you. Thanksgiving was supposed to be safe, predictable. 26 people crowded into my parents' dining room laughing too loudly, passing plates, pretending history didn't exist. Then my stepsister stood up with my laptop in her hands, not borrowed, not accidental. She smiled and said she wanted to show everyone how far I'd fallen, how little I had, how hard my life had become. She turned the screen toward the room. The number appeared before anyone could look away: $13,870,425. Silence collapsed. A fork slipped from my mother's fingers. My father stood too fast, his chair scraping the wall. My stepsister froze, whispering it wasn't mine, that it had to be a mistake. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye on me for the first time in years, and said, "No, it's mine. That money wasn't the story, it was the evidence. And if you're still here, thank you for staying with me." If any of this feels close to home, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. If you decide to keep listening or subscribe, please know I'm truly grateful. My name is Lena Hawkins. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was taught to believe that what happened in our house was normal. Not kind, not fair, but necessary. That's the word my mother liked. Necessary. When I was young, things were ordinary enough. Not warm exactly, but balanced. I had a bedroom with a window that faced the street. I ate dinner at the table. My parents spoke to me in full sentences. I didn't feel loved, but I felt accounted for. That changed the year Bryn was born. She arrived early. Too early. The kind of early that turns hospital hallways into waiting rooms for fear. I was 6. I remember sitting on a plastic chair with my feet not quite touching the floor, swinging them back and forth while adults whispered in tight circles. When Bryn came home, she brought the hospital with her. Suddenly, the house had rules that hadn't existed before. Shoes off at the door, hands washed twice, windows closed even in summer. Surfaces wiped down constantly, the sharp smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. My mother stopped sleeping through the night. My father spoke in warnings instead of plans, and I became a problem. The first time it happened, I thought it was temporary. I had a runny nose. Nothing dramatic. I remember standing in the hallway while my mother packed a small bag for me, her movements quick and irritated. She didn't look at my face when she spoke. "You need to go stay with your aunt for a few days," she said. "We can't take chances." I asked when I could come back. She paused, then said, "When it's safe." Safe became a word that didn't include me. It happened again when I coughed. Again when I had a fever. Once when I didn't have symptoms at all, but one of Bryn's doctors mentioned risk factors during an appointment. Each time I was removed quietly, efficiently, like an object that didn't belong in the room anymore. No one ever said I was unwanted. They didn't have to. They said things like, "You understand, right? And you're the older one, and this is just how it has to be." I learned early that arguing made things worse. Crying didn't help. Asking questions only prolonged the discomfort. So I stopped asking. By the time I was 8, I knew how to pack my own overnight bag. I knew which drawer my aunt kept spare pajamas in. I knew not to complain when I was sent away for days at a time. I learned to keep my distance at home, to sit farther down the couch, to hover in doorways instead of entering rooms fully. Bryn grew stronger, healthier, louder. My parents relaxed around her in ways they never did around me. They watched her breathe when she slept. They hovered when she walked. They praised her for things I was expected to do quietly. If she cried, the house stopped. If I did, the sound seemed to pass straight through the walls without leaving a mark. I remember once sneezing at the dinner table. Just once. My mother's chair scraped back so fast it startled everyone. She told me to go to my room. Then she told me to pack. "What if Bryn gets sick?" she said like an accusation. That was the moment something shifted. I realized this wasn't about illness anymore. It was about blame. From then on, my presence came with conditions. Be quiet. Be careful. Be clean. Don't touch. Don't interrupt. Don't breathe too close. I started monitoring myself the way my parents monitored Bryn, counting coughs, swallowing sneezes, holding my breath when I walked past her room. I learned to see myself the way they did, not as a child, but as a variable, a risk, something that needed to be managed. No one ever sat me down and explained it. There was no conversation where my parents acknowledged what was happening. They didn't frame it as cruelty. They framed it as responsibility. As love even. But love, I would learn much later, doesn't require one child to disappear so another can feel safe. Back then, all I knew was the house no longer belonged to me, and neither did the people inside it. By the time I reached middle school, the rules were no longer spoken out loud. They didn't need to be. They lived in the way my parents' eyes moved past me, in the way conversations shifted when I entered a room, in how decisions were made without my input, and explained afterward as facts. Favoritism sounds like something loud, obvious, like gifts wrapped in front of you or names shouted with pride. What I lived with was quieter, more efficient. It functioned like a system that had been tested and refined until no one questioned it anymore. When I won first place at the regional science fair, my teacher called my parents personally. She left a message on our answering machine. This was before cell phones were common, praising my project, my presentation, my composure. I stood in the hallway and listened to the recording twice, my heart beating faster each time. At dinner that night, I mentioned it. My father asked if the materials I used had any chemicals that could trigger Bryn's allergies. My mother wanted to know if the display board had been stored anywhere near Bryn's room. No one said congratulations. A month later, Bryn brought home a certificate for Most Improved in Music class. It was a plastic folder with a gold sticker crookedly attached. My parents cleared space on the refrigerator immediately. My mother called her parents. My father took photos. I learned something that night: effort mattered less than fragility. When I was 12, I played violin. I practiced in short, careful sessions so the sound wouldn't carry too far. I loved it quietly, the way you love something you know can be taken away. My instructor scheduled my first recital on a Friday evening. I wrote the date on the calendar in blue marker and circled it twice. The day of the recital, my mother told me they couldn't come. Bryn had a school performance. She was playing the flute. She missed notes sometimes. She got nervous. They need us more, my mother said, already reaching for her purse. I sat on a folding chair backstage that night and watched other parents lean forward in their seats, phones raised, eyes shining. When my turn came, I scanned the room anyway. Habit is hard to break. My seat was empty. I played cleanly, precisely. I bowed and walked off stage without crying. I'd learned by then that tears only embarrassed people. Bryn learned different lessons. She learned that sickness could be negotiated, that tears created urgency, that adults responded faster when her voice shook. If she didn't want to take a test, she complained of dizziness. If she missed an assignment, my mother called the school and asked for extensions. Teachers learned quickly which child came with paperwork and which one didn't. I watched it all from the edges, not angry, confused. I couldn't understand how the same parents could react so differently to two children living under the same roof. I wondered if I was doing something wrong, if there was a tone I wasn't using, a weakness I hadn't discovered yet. At night, I lay in bed and replayed conversations in my head, trying to locate the moment I lost them. I searched for a mistake, a word, a look, something concrete I could fix. But there was nothing. By the time I reached high school, the system was complete. Bryn was protected. I was managed. My successes were tolerated as long as they didn't inconvenience anyone. My failures, rare as they were treated as personal shortcomings rather than opportunities for help. I stopped bringing home certificates. I stopped mentioning grades. I learned to fold my achievements inward to make them small enough not to disrupt the balance of the house. One night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I said something out loud that surprised me. I'm not really their daughter. It didn't sound dramatic. It sounded accurate. I wasn't rejected outright. I was simply unnecessary. A presence without a role. A child who took up space but didn't belong to the narrative my parents had chosen to tell about themselves. And once I understood that, something hardened in me. If I wasn't essential, I could be independent. If I wasn't protected, I could protect myself. I didn't know how yet. I just knew I couldn't keep waiting to be seen. By the time I reached middle school, the rules were no longer spoken out loud. They didn't need to be. They lived in the way my parents' eyes moved past me, in the way conversations shifted when I entered a room, in how decisions were made without my input and explained afterward as facts. Favoritism sounds like something loud, obvious, like gifts wrapped in front of you or names shouted with pride. What I lived with was quieter, more efficient. It functioned like a system that had been tested and refined until no one questioned it anymore. When I won first place at the regional science fair, my teacher called my parents personally. She left a message on our answering machine. This was before cell phones were common, praising my project, my presentation, my composure. I stood in the hallway and listened to the recording twice, my heart beating faster each time. At dinner that night, I mentioned it. My father asked if the materials I used had any chemicals that could trigger Bryn's allergies. My mother wanted to know if the display board had been stored anywhere near Bryn's room. No one said congratulations. A month later, Bryn brought home a certificate for most improved in music class. It was a plastic folder with a gold sticker crookedly attached. My parents cleared space on the refrigerator immediately. My mother called her parents. My father took photos. I learned something that night: effort mattered less than fragility. When I was 12, I played violin. I practiced in short, careful sessions so the sound wouldn't carry too far. I loved it quietly, the way you love something you know can be taken away. My instructor scheduled my first recital on a Friday evening. I wrote the date on the calendar in blue marker and circled it twice. The day of the recital, my mother told me they couldn't come. Bryn had a school performance. She was playing the flute. She missed notes sometimes. She got nervous. They need us more, my mother said, already reaching for her purse. I sat on a folding chair backstage that night and watched other parents lean forward in their seats, phones raised, eyes shining. When my turn came, I scanned the room anyway. Habit is hard to break. My seat was empty. I played cleanly, precisely. I bowed and walked off stage without crying. I'd learned by then that tears only embarrassed people. Bryn learned different lessons. She learned that sickness could be negotiated, that tears created urgency, that adults responded faster when her voice shook. If she didn't want to take a test, she complained of dizziness. If she missed an assignment, my mother called the school and asked for extensions. Teachers learned quickly which child came with paperwork and which one didn't. I watched it all from the edges. Not angry, confused. I couldn't understand how the same parents could react so differently to two children living under the same roof. I wondered if I was doing something wrong, if there was a tone I wasn't using, a weakness I hadn't discovered yet. At night, I lay in bed and replayed conversations in my head, trying to locate the moment I lost them. I searched for a mistake, a word, a look, something concrete I could fix. But there was nothing. By the time I reached high school, the system was complete. Bryn was protected. I was managed. My successes were tolerated as long as they didn't inconvenience anyone. My failures, rare as they were treated as personal shortcomings rather than opportunities for help. I stopped bringing home certificates. I stopped mentioning grades. I learned to fold my achievements inward to make them small enough not to disrupt the balance of the house. One night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I said something out loud that surprised me. I'm not really their daughter. It didn't sound dramatic. It sounded accurate. I wasn't rejected outright. I was simply unnecessary. A presence without a role. A child who took up space but didn't belong to the narrative my parents had chosen to tell about themselves. And once I understood that something hardened in me, if I wasn't essential, I could be independent. If I wasn't protected, I could protect myself. I didn't know how yet. I just knew I couldn't keep waiting to be seen. By the time I started high school, I had already decided that it wasn't a place to belong. It was a place to pass through. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't frame it as rebellion. I treated it like a long hallway with an exit sign at the far end, and every year was just another step toward it. I studied the way other people studied religion, methodically, without emotion. I learned which classes weighed the most, which teachers graded hardest, which extracurriculars translated into opportunities later. I didn't join things because they were fun. I joined them because they stacked. After school, I worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a grocery store, one at a local cafe. I learned how to close registers, mop floors, smile at customers who didn't look back at me. The money didn't stay with me long. My parents said it was good for me to contribute. I handed over most of my paycheck without argument. It felt safer than explaining what I might need it for someday. At night, I stayed up later than everyone else. The house went quiet after Bryn went to sleep. That was when I could breathe. I spread textbooks across my bed and worked until my eyes burned. I liked the clarity of it. Questions with answers. Problems that resolved if you followed the rules. Debate team became my refuge. Not because I liked speaking, but because it taught me how to think without asking permission. I learned how to build arguments that didn't rely on emotion, how to stay calm when someone tried to talk over me, how to wait, then speak once precisely and sit back down. When my SAT scores came back, I opened the envelope alone in my room. 1,590. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the number longer than I should have. It didn't feel like pride. It felt like proof. That I hadn't imagined my way out. That I was capable of something beyond endurance. At dinner, I mentioned it carefully. Not celebratory, just factual. My mother didn't look up from her plate. "Can you keep your voice down?" she said. "Bryn is studying." I nodded and pushed my chair back. The conversation ended there. Report cards followed the same pattern. My A's stayed folded inside backpacks, edges soft from being handled but never displayed. Bryn's grades, good or bad, went straight onto the refrigerator. Her struggles were framed. Mine were absorbed and forgotten. Once I asked why. My father sighed like I'd asked something unreasonable. "She needs encouragement," he said. "You don't." That sentence stayed with me longer than any insult ever could. I stopped expecting reactions. I started planning instead. College brochures were hidden under my mattress. I researched scholarships on library computers. I learned how to fill out applications without help. I memorized deadlines the way some people memorize birthdays. My parents assumed I would stay local, that I would adjust my life around Bryn's, that I would continue to be available. They talked about my future in vague, passive terms, like it was something that would happen to me rather than something I could choose. I didn't correct them. Senior year arrived quietly. I was accepted into advanced programs, earned recommendations, took on leadership roles that didn't require anyone to show up for me. When teachers praised my discipline, my parents smiled politely and changed the subject. The night I realized I was already gone came unexpectedly. I was standing in the kitchen washing a mug, listening to my parents talk in the living room. They were discussing Bryn's college options. Which schools would support her? Which campuses were close enough to home? Which ones would accommodate her? My name never came up. And for the first time, that didn't hurt. It clarified something. I wasn't being held back anymore. I was being ignored. And that meant there was nothing tying me to their expectations. I went to my room and opened a notebook. On the first page, I wrote one sentence. This is my way out. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't hopeful. It was practical. Like a plan sketched in pencil, ready to be adjusted but already real. I didn't need permission. I didn't need applause. I just needed distance. And I was close enough to see it. I never announced that I was applying to colleges. I didn't make it a conversation or a milestone. I treated it the way I treated everything important, quietly at night with the door closed. I filled out applications after everyone else went to sleep. The glow of my laptop dimmed until the letters blurred together. 14 schools, different states, different distances. Each one felt less like ambition and more like a calculation. How far was far enough? When the acceptance letter from the University of Washington arrived, it came in a thick envelope that bent slightly when I held it. I didn't open it right away. I set it on my desk and stared at my name printed across the front as if it belonged to someone else. When I finally read the letter, I read it twice, slowly. I wasn't excited. I was steady. Like I'd reached a conclusion I'd been moving toward for years without saying it out loud. I told my parents a few days later at the kitchen table. I chose a neutral moment. No stress, no distractions. I said the words carefully without inflection, the way you deliver information you don't expect to be received. My mother asked who would help Bryn if I left. She didn't look at me when she said it. My father frowned, said Seattle was too far, that it didn't make sense that family should stay close. I waited for a follow-up question. For interest. For anything resembling curiosity. It didn't come. Later that week, my father called me into the garage. The door was halfway open, cold air moving in. He leaned against the workbench and spoke like he was explaining something obvious. "We're not paying for it," he said. "The money is for Bryn." There was no anger in his voice, no apology, just a statement of fact. I nodded. I thanked him. That part surprised him. I could tell by the way his eyebrows lifted the pause that followed. He was prepared for resistance, for negotiation. Instead, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, exactly, but certainty. I left with 2 suitcases and a box of books. My parents hugged me quickly, already distracted. Bryn asked if Seattle had good shopping and went back to her phone. No one asked when I'd be home. No one said they'd miss me. College was quieter than I expected. Not easier, just cleaner. Professors remembered my name. Effort had consequences. When I spoke, people listened without needing to be convinced. I worked between classes, then full-time during breaks. I learned how to live on schedules I made for myself, how to stretch money without resenting it, how to exist without being monitored. I graduated summa cum laude. The ceremony took place on a clear morning. Rows of chairs filled with families leaning forward, scanning the stage. When my name was called, I walked across and looked out anyway. I'd learned not to expect anything but habits linger. The seats where my parents might have sat were empty. So was the feeling I used to brace for when I noticed things like that. I didn't call them afterward. Neither did they. My first job came through a professor who noticed how I handled objects, how careful I was, how precise. I was hired at an auction house in Seattle that specialized in antiques and estate collections. The work was quiet and exacting. I cataloged items, researched histories, traced ownership through faded documents and handwritten notes. I liked the discipline of it, the way value could be proven instead of argued. When I told my parents what I was doing, my mother laughed softly. "So you sell old things," she said, like the conversation was finished. I let it be. The distance between us became routine. Short calls on holidays, brief updates that didn't invite questions. I sent small amounts of money when I could, framed as help, not explanation. They never asked how I managed. They assumed I struggled. That assumption made things easier to maintain. Sometimes late at night, I thought about the ceremony again, about those empty chairs, about what it would have meant if they'd shown up. The thought no longer hurt the way it once had. It felt abstract, like imagining a different version of myself that had already passed out of reach. I was building something quietly, not to prove anything, not to be seen, just to exist without shrinking. For the first time, my life wasn't organized around avoiding disappointment. It was organized around moving forward. I didn't recognize what I was good at right away. It wasn't framed as talent. It wasn't encouraged or named. It showed up quietly, the way instincts do when no one is watching. At the auction house, my job was supposed to be simple log items, verify condition, attach notes. I did it carefully, slowly, because that's how I'd learned to survive. Attention had always been safer than speed. One afternoon, a small estate collection came in from a house outside Tacoma. Nothing dramatic. Boxes of jewelry wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age, costume pieces mixed with real metals, the kind of lot people skim through without expectation. I was halfway through cataloging when something caught my eye. Not shine, not size, but proportion. A necklace that didn't match the rest of the box. The clasp was worn in a way that suggested frequent use. The stones were set too precisely to be decorative filler. I flagged it. Quietly. The preliminary valuation came back low. I hesitated. Then I pulled additional references. Auction records, maker marks, old sales catalogs. The more I looked, the more the numbers stopped making sense. I asked for a second review, then a third. When it finally sold, the hammer came down at $52,000. My supervisor stared at the screen like it had glitched. He asked me to walk him through my process. I did step by step, my voice steady, my hands still. I wasn't excited. I was focused. That reaction seemed to unsettle him more than the sale itself. After that, things changed. Slowly at first, I was given more responsibility, more access. Collections others had skimmed past landed on my desk. I worked through them, patiently, learning to trust the quiet sense that told me when something didn't fit the story it was being sold with. A few months later, I identified a private collection that had been severely undervalued. The final total came in just over $300,000. This time, the room went quiet for a different reason. I was promoted. The word felt strange when it was said out loud. Not undeserved, just unfamiliar. I accepted it the way I'd learned to accept everything else without visible reaction. But something had shifted. For the first time, my precision wasn't just tolerated, it was sought out. Still, the ceiling was visible. Auction houses have hierarchies that don't move quickly, and loyalty often mattered more than accuracy. I watched people with louder voices take credit for quieter work. I didn't resent it. I noted it. I started taking on independent appraisals in the evenings. Small jobs at first. One piece here, one estate there. Word spread slowly, the way it does when trust matters more than advertising. Clients returned. Then they referred others. The numbers grew. Not dramatically, but consistently. The decision to leave wasn't emotional. It was practical. I ran the numbers, compared margins, calculated risk. I gave notice without explanation. My first office was above a laundromat. The sign downstairs flickered. The stairwell smelled like detergent and fried food from the shop next door. The walls were thin. I could hear coins dropping into machines while I reviewed six-figure items under fluorescent light. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't meant to be. What it was mine. I furnished it with a desk I bought secondhand and shelves I assembled myself. I worked longer hours than I ever had, not out of desperation but momentum. There was no one to impress, no one to explain myself to. Just the work and the accuracy of it. I didn't tell my family. There was no reason to. They still believed I was scraping by in Seattle, living carefully, barely ahead of rent. When I sent money home, $6,000 a month, they accepted it without question. My parents framed it as sacrifice, proof that I hadn't done well enough to keep it. Bryn's life expanded accordingly. designer bags, flights that crossed oceans, programs with tuition numbers I recognized immediately. My father spoke about her with pride I'd never heard directed at me. "She's really going places," he said once. "You should see how hard she's working." I listened. I said nothing. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been invited to guest lecture at one of the programs Bryn applied to. Not because of my name, because of my work. I stood in front of rooms filled with people who took notes when I spoke, who asked questions that mattered. I kept my distance intact. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I had learned something important by then. That visibility isn't the same as value, that being underestimated can be a form of protection, and that some successes grow better in rooms where no one is watching closely enough to interfere. Maintaining two versions of my life wasn't difficult. It was familiar. I'd been doing it for years, speaking carefully, sharing selectively, letting assumptions stand when correcting them would only complicate things. The difference now was scale. What I kept private had grown large enough to distort the picture my family still held of me. I sent my parents money every month. $6,000 transferred automatically, time to arrive before the end of their billing cycles. I framed it as help, not support. Something I could spare because I lived simply. They never questioned it. In their minds, it confirmed what they already believed, that I was managing, but just barely. That I was disciplined because I had to be. They told me not to worry about it. Then they worried loudly anyway. My mother mentioned rising costs, utilities, insurance, small emergencies that always seemed to land on Bryn. My father talked about sacrifices, about how families pull together. I listened and nodded and said I was glad to help. It was easier than explaining that the money wasn't a strain, that it wasn't a choice between groceries and generosity. Bryn's life expanded in proportion to what I sent. She bought designer bags without checking price tags, flew to Dubai for networking, enrolled in an MBA program with tuition figures that made administrators speak slowly when they said them out loud. My parents talked about her schedule with reverence, about how hard she was working, how much pressure she was under. "She's really doing something with her life," my father said once, pride thick in his voice. "You should see how driven she is." I agreed. I let the praise pass through me without friction. They assumed I ate cheaply, that I saved aggressively, that I denied myself so I could keep contributing. When my mother asked how I managed, I said I cooked at home and avoided unnecessary expenses. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the full picture. I kept my office address vague, my work described in generalities. Appraisals, I said. Consulting. Words that sounded small enough not to invite curiosity. When they asked if business was slow, I said it fluctuated. When they asked if I was tired, I said I was used to it. What I didn't say was that I'd been invited to guest lecture at one of the business programs Bryn applied to, that my name was on a syllabus she'd likely skimmed without noticing, that I stood at podiums speaking about valuation ethics, market distortions, and the cost of misrepresentation while she sat in waiting rooms hoping for acceptance letters. I didn't correct the irony. I didn't share the coincidence. It felt unnecessary, not secretive, protective. The more successful I became, the more careful I grew. Not because I feared their reaction, but because I understood it. Exposure wouldn't bring recognition. It would bring entitlement. Questions about fairness, about what I owed, about how much of my life should be redistributed to compensate for theirs. I'd learned the pattern too well to pretend otherwise. There were moments, those small, quiet ones, when the weight of it pressed in. When my father called to praise Bryn's achievements using money I'd provided. When my mother thanked me for helping out in the same breath she asked if I'd considered moving closer to be more available. When Bryn sent photos from places I recognized only from auction catalogs and shipping invoices. I felt something then. Not anger, not jealousy. Distance. I realized I was still orbiting a family that didn't know me, held in place by habits I'd outgrown. The support I offered wasn't connection, it was maintenance. It kept the structure standing without changing its design. And still I stayed quiet. Part of me believed silence was kinder, that as long as they didn't know they couldn't demand more. Another part, smaller, more honest, understood that I wasn't ready to see what would happen if I stopped, because stopping wouldn't just change the numbers, it would change the story they told about me. I'd spent my life being underestimated. I knew how to survive that. What I didn't know yet was how they'd respond when the version of me they relied on stopped existing. I told myself I'd wait. That timing mattered. That there would be a moment when the truth would surface naturally without confrontation. I didn't know then how close that moment already was. Thanksgiving came around again the way it always did, announced early, planned, loudly treated as proof that nothing fundamental had changed. My mother called weeks in advance to say her back had been acting up. She mentioned it casually at first, then more pointedly, as if waiting to see whether I would respond. I did. I arranged catering from a local place she liked, paid in advance, asked them to handle everything so she wouldn't have to stand for long. She thanked me, then reminded me not to overspend. I arrived that afternoon to a house already full. Coats piled on the bed in the guest room. Voices overlapping in the kitchen. 26 people by my count. Relatives I recognized and some I didn't. Family friends who knew my name, but not much else. I set my bag down and slipped into the rhythm of the room the way I always had, present but peripheral. Bryn was already performing. She moved easily between groups, laughing too loudly, telling stories that framed her as busy, overwhelmed, important. She barely acknowledged me except to comment on the food when the catering arrived. "Store-bought?" she asked, lifting a lid and peering inside. "Figures." I didn't respond. I was watching an auction in Hong Kong on my laptop, muted the screen, angled away from the room. It was a piece I'd been tracking for months, and the timing mattered. I stayed near the dining table, pretending to check messages, listening with half an ear to conversations that never included me. My mother glanced over occasionally, her eyes flicking between the laptop and the guests. She asked if I could put it away so it wouldn't seem rude. I said I would in a minute. Bryn noticed. She crossed the room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked what I was doing, her tone light, curious in a way that felt rehearsed. Before I could answer, she reached for the laptop. "Let's show everyone how hard you're working," she said, "so they can see how you're getting by." She took it from my hands before I could react. Not aggressively, casually, as if it belonged to her. She turned toward the room, lifting the screen so people could see. "I think it's important to be honest," she said, "about where we are in life." The auction window was still open. Behind it, my account dashboard refreshed automatically. The number filled the screen. $13,870,425. The room didn't quiet immediately. There was a moment, a fraction of a second, where people leaned forward, trying to understand what they were seeing. Then the sound drained out of the space like air from a punctured tire. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and struck the plate. My father stood so abruptly his chair tipped back. Someone laughed, then stopped. Bryn stared at the screen, her smile collapsing into something unrecognizable. She shook her head. That's not yours," she said, her voice thin. "That's a mistake." I closed the laptop gently and took it back. I stood up without raising my voice. "No," I said. "It's mine." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The damage was already done. Faces shifted. People recalculated. The story they'd been carrying about me, quiet, struggling, unremarkable, no longer fit the evidence in front of them. My mother found her voice first. She asked what this meant. My father asked how long. Bryn asked why she didn't know. Questions layered on top of one another, urgent, demanding, unfiltered. I waited for them to finish. "That money," I said, "comes from years of work you never asked about. Years you assumed didn't matter." I didn't accuse. I stated. The difference mattered. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else looked away. The room felt smaller than it had before, as if the walls had moved in while everyone was distracted. Bryn tried to laugh it off. She said it must be temporary, that numbers fluctuate, that it didn't mean anything real. My father looked at her, then back at me, as if deciding which version of reality to accept. I didn't push. I thanked the guests for coming. I said I had work to attend to. I gathered my things and left before anyone could stop me. No one followed. They stood there suspended between explanations. In the car, my hands shook for the first time that night. Not from fear, from release. I hadn't planned to reveal anything. I hadn't rehearsed it. But the truth had surfaced anyway, not as confession, but as consequence. And once it was out, there was no way to fold it back into something smaller. I drove away knowing one thing with certainty. The story they'd told about me was over. What came next would be louder. The calls started before I reached the highway. My phone lit up on the passenger seat, vibrating against the console, my mother's name flashing again and again. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know what she would say, but because I already did. By the time I got home, the messages had stacked into something that felt coordinated. Questions at first. Confusion. Then urgency. My father left a voicemail asking me to come back and explain myself. Bryn texted that she was embarrassed that people had misunderstood, that I'd made her look foolish. None of them asked if I was okay. None of them asked how long I'd been doing the work that built what they'd just seen. They asked what it meant for them. The next morning, my mother called again. I answered this time. She didn't ease into it. "How could you let us struggle like this?" she said. "All these years." I waited for her to finish. She talked about bills, about sacrifices, about how unfair it was that I'd kept something so significant from family. She spoke as if the money had existed independently of me, like a resource I'd withheld out of spite, rather than earned in isolation. Bryn took the phone at some point. Her voice was unsteady, practiced in the way people sound when they expect sympathy. "I deserve a share," she said. "You know that. I've worked hard too. You wouldn't even be where you are without everything we went through." That was when my father's voice cut in louder than the others. "You owe us," he said. "Everything you have came from this family. Don't forget that." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I let the words land where they would. Then I said the only thing that was true. "No," I said. "I don't owe you anything." There was silence. Not disbelief, offense, as if I'd violated an unspoken contract they'd assumed was permanent. The demands came quickly after that. $2 million to start. A vacation property in California they'd had their eye on for years. Support, they called it. Rebalancing. Making things right. I told them no. I explained calmly that the monthly transfers would stop immediately, that I would not be funding anyone else's lifestyle, that any further contact about money would go through my attorney. My mother cried. Bryn shouted. My father accused me of abandoning them. The words blurred together, familiar in structure if not content. I ended the call without saying goodbye. 2 days later, they showed up at my office. They didn't call ahead. They walked in together as if arriving as a unit would strengthen their position. My receptionist froze. I asked her to step outside. I stood and faced them across the desk I'd bought secondhand years earlier, the shelves behind me lined with files they'd never asked about. My mother went straight to anger. My father demanded explanations. Bryn cried loudly, glancing toward the door as if hoping someone else would witness her distress. I listened. Then I pressed a button under my desk. Security arrived quietly, professionally. I didn't look away as my parents were escorted out of the office I'd built without them. Bryn protested, saying this was humiliating. I thought of Thanksgiving. I thought of my laptop. When the door closed, the room felt larger than it ever had. That afternoon, I called my attorney. We drafted a cease and desist letter. I changed my phone number. I put a hold on all financial transfers. I began the process of separating my life from theirs in ways that couldn't be argued away later. My grandmother Evelyn called that evening. She didn't ask for explanations. She didn't defend anyone. She said she'd known something was wrong for a long time, even if she hadn't understood it fully. She told me she was proud of me. Then she told me she'd decided to stop speaking to my mother. I should have done it sooner, she said quietly. The aftermath unfolded the way things always do when a narrative collapses. Bryn tried to rebrand herself. She opened her own appraisal business, announced it loudly, framed it as independence. Within months, clients began questioning her credentials. A few pieces were exposed as misrepresented. The reputation she'd tried to borrow didn't hold. My parents told people they didn't need my money, that they'd cut ties first, that they were better off without me. I let them tell that story. It cost me nothing. What surprised me wasn't the fallout. It was the calm underneath it. For the first time, my life wasn't shaped around preventing conflict. The tension I'd lived with for decades had loosened its grip. I slept through the night. I breathed fully. I made decisions without rehearsing how they'd be received. I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd stepped out of a role they'd assigned me without consent. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something simple and irreversible. I was free. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It arrived in layers like dust settling after a collapse. At first, there were still messages forwarded, screenshots, secondhand comments, distant relatives testing the waters to see which version of the story I would confirm. I didn't respond. I didn't correct. I let the noise burn itself out. What remained was quieter than I expected. My grandmother Evelyn became the only consistent voice from that side of my family. She didn't call to relay information or ask questions she already knew the answers to. She called to talk about ordinary things, the weather changing a book she'd finished, a recipe she couldn't quite remember the measurements for. Sometimes we didn't talk much at all. We stayed on the line, breathing in parallel the way people do when they no longer need to fill space to prove connection. She told me she'd stopped speaking to my mother entirely. Not dramatically. Not as punishment. Just a decision made after years of watching patterns repeat themselves without consequence. I don't want to be part of it anymore, she said. And neither should you. I hired a lawyer and finished what I'd started. Formal letters. Clear boundaries. No room for reinterpretation. I moved to a new place with controlled access and cameras I hoped I'd never have to review. I changed routines, adjusted schedules. It wasn't fear that drove those decisions, it was closure. I wanted my life to be difficult to interrupt. My parents' version of events evolved quickly. In their telling, they were the ones who'd cut ties. They said they didn't need my money, that they'd raised me well enough to succeed and didn't expect anything in return. I heard this through others, never directly. The story wasn't for me. It was for them. Bryn's attempt at reinvention didn't last. Her appraisal business launched loudly with polished branding and borrowed language. Within months, discrepancies surfaced. Inconsistent valuations. Pieces presented without proper documentation. Clients began asking questions she couldn't answer. The credibility she tried to assume didn't come with the discipline required to maintain it. I didn't comment. I didn't intervene. I wasn't interested in watching someone else repeat my work without understanding it. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt watching it unravel. There was no sense of victory, just confirmation. You can't build something solid using borrowed foundations. The real change happened in smaller ways. I stopped bracing myself when my phone rang. I stopped replaying conversations after they ended, searching for mistakes. I noticed how my shoulders sat lower when I worked, how my breathing slowed when I locked my door at night, how quiet no longer felt like anticipation, it felt like peace. For years, I'd confused endurance with strength. I thought surviving meant staying, absorbing, adapting endlessly. It took distance to understand that survival is a skill, not a destination, and skills are meant to be set down when they're no longer needed. I didn't lose my family the night the truth came out. I'd been losing them gradually since childhood, one unacknowledged moment at a time. What I gained wasn't replacement, it was space. Space to live without translating myself. Space to succeed without apology. Space to exist without being measured against someone else's needs. I still work long hours. I still care deeply about accuracy, about fairness, about getting things right. Those traits didn't come from neglect alone, but they were sharpened by it. I don't resent that anymore. I understand it. Some families protect their image at all costs. Some children learn early that love is conditional, and some people spend years trying to earn something that was never offered freely to begin with. What I learned slowly, imperfectly, is that you don't have to keep proving your worth to people who benefit from you doubting it. Walking away didn't make me harder. It made me lighter. For the first time in my life, I can say this without hesitation: I am at peace. After everything settled, after the noise thinned out and the story stopped being passed from mouth to mouth, I found myself sitting in a quiet that felt unfamiliar, not empty, not lonely, just unoccupied. For most of my life, silence had meant waiting for the next demand, the next misunderstanding, the next moment I would need to explain myself. This silence asked nothing. I used to think survival meant endurance, that if I could tolerate enough, adapt fast enough, stay useful enough, eventually something would soften. That love or fairness or recognition would arrive as a reward for persistence. It took years to understand that endurance can keep you alive, but it can also keep you trapped. When survival becomes your identity, you stop noticing how much it costs you to maintain it. There are families that don't fracture loudly. They don't shout or break apart in obvious ways. They remain intact by quietly assigning roles: who gets protected, who gets praised, who absorbs what's left over. If you're the one absorbing, it can take a long time to realize that the role was never temporary, that there was no moment coming where the balance would be restored. Walking away from that dynamic didn't feel brave at the time. It felt necessary. Like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying so long I forgot it wasn't part of my body. I didn't leave with anger or speeches or final words meant to land. I left with boundaries, with paperwork, with distance, with the understanding that clarity is kinder than continued participation in something that diminishes you. What I gained wasn't revenge or validation. It was alignment. My work finally matched my values. My days stopped revolving around managing other people's expectations. My decisions became quieter, cleaner, my own. I didn't need witnesses anymore. I didn't need permission. I still believe family can be a place of safety. I just no longer believe it has to be the one you're born into. Sometimes family is what you build later out of mutual respect and shared effort. Sometimes it's simply the relationship you have with yourself when no one else is watching. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I want you to know something: noticing isn't betrayal. Choosing yourself isn't cruelty. And distance doesn't erase what you've already survived, it gives it context. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, I'd really appreciate hearing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if you choose to like the video or subscribe, thank you for that too. It helps more than you know, and I'm genuinely grateful you spent this time here with me.